One of the most pervasive and enduring ethical issues in the history of our culture, particularly in the United States, is that of discrimination. Equality and discrimination. Now, on paper, the United States was formed as a republic in order to ensure the equality of all of its citizens. And the idea was that the government would govern basically out of an authority that was derived from the consent of the people. And so the notion was that all men were created equal and endowed with their Creator by certain unalienable rights, that among which are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And basically the idea was that the government was formed in order to protect those rights, but everybody should have rights and everybody should equally have rights. However, what was idealized on paper and what was actually borne out in practice are two very, very different things, as history will attest to. But the ethical issue of equality and discrimination is certainly one that the United States has struggled with since its very inception and even before then. But that's going to be the topic that we're going to look at today. But before we get sort of started into the nuts and bolts of it, let me just ask the question for rhetorical purposes, or for us to consider: is discrimination always bad? Is discrimination always bad? In other words, is it always wrong to discriminate against someone or some things? Discrimination always a bad thing? Now, certainly the notion of discrimination is one that carries a negative connotation or a negative association in our culture. But does that mean that it's always bad? Does that mean that that there never can be a place for discrimination? For example, when I was just graduating high school, I was looking around for a better job. Throughout high school, I worked a part-time job at Burger King, and I thought, now that I'm a high school graduate, I ought to look to something that's a little bit more, pays a little bit better, has better hours, this sort of thing. Something that I can begin to establish a resume with, or something. I don't know. I was just looking for a change, and anyway, I went and looked for a job at the airport, and there was an organization that used to be called Emory Worldwide. I think it's Evergreen now, but anyway, they contracted to be a mail carrier and sorting facility for the U.S. Postal Service. And so anyway, I went in for my interview for this job, for this position, and they asked me all the normal interview questions and this sort of thing, and at the end of the interview, the person that was giving the interview said, "Well, one last thing I want you to do is this. I want you to go and take that box that's on the floor over in the corner, and I want you to put it up on this shelf." So, okay, well, there was a shelf that was about chest high and a box that was full of what looked to be like mail or papers or something like that. And so I took the box, and it was a fairly heavy box, but I put it up at chest high. And as soon as I did, the person says, "Well, we can start you on Monday." So what was that all about? Well, you see, the part of the job that I was applying for in the mail sort included the practice of, or the process of, sorting any kind of mail that came in. And so I would stand at the bottom of this chute, and the mail would come down the chute on a belt, and this conveyor belt would carry it in front of me, and each bag of mail would have a tag on it based on the location that it was supposed to go. And so I would take the bag, and I would sort them in one of 6 or 7 different chutes or belts, depending on what general region it was supposed to go to. So that's what I would do. But these bags were pretty heavy. They're full of mail, so they're kind of heavy. In fact, one bag could weigh up to 75 pounds if it was full completely. And part of the qualification for the job was to be able to lift those things. Now, you might think about that for just a moment and think, well, that's all well and good. That's what the job entailed. Therefore, if I couldn't do that, then I was not qualified for employment, at least in that capacity. But think about the different groups of people, or the different kinds of people that requirement discriminated against, right? Because effectively that requirement discriminated against, for example, people who were too weak to move the mailbag, Or maybe people who were too short to move the mailbag. If they were too short and could not put it up on the shelf, then they would not have qualified either. So maybe people who were physically disabled in some way and maybe wheelchair bound, they would not have been able to complete that particular requirement, and so that requirement would have discriminated against an entire swath of different kinds of people. So, but is that bad? Is that unjust? Is that wrong to say that? Now, I think most reasonable people would say, well, that particular job, in order to accomplish it, in order to be equipped for it, you've got to have a certain skill set, which amounts to a certain level of physical prowess. If you lack that certain level of physical prowess, then you should not be even applying for that kind of job. I mean, if you can't do the job, then don't apply for it. Similarly, my background is in philosophy and ethics. It's in theology and Bible and biblical understanding and things like this, counseling. But you wouldn't find me trying to go and pass to get a medical license in order to practice medicine. Why not? Well, I don't know a whole lot in that realm, and I'm glad that there are certain qualifications that prevent people who don't know a whole lot in that realm from gaining employment as doctors and nurses and so forth. Because if I ever have to have surgery, I certainly don't want somebody who isn't well qualified, well equipped, cutting me open and messing around with my insides. So I'm glad that there is a certain set of criteria that discriminates against people who don't have that kind of knowledge. So I think that innately we know that there has to be some level of discrimination based on qualifications for things like employment and things like that. However, and those would be kind of just forms of discrimination. However, what about unjust discrimination, or what about discrimination that is not good? Now, we all know that can happen. That certainly can happen. And so here's what I'd like to do for the remainder of this lecture. I want to specialize the use of the term discrimination to refer to those instances of discrimination that are unjust. And so, for the most part, unless I say otherwise, when I mention the word discrimination here, I'm going to be limiting my discussion to forms of unjust discrimination. Now, I might later on break it back out and try to say, okay, is this an example of just discrimination or unjust? At that time, I'll make the distinction. However, for the purposes of the rest of this, we're going to be talking about unjust discrimination. So what is unjust discrimination? Well, let's go ahead and give a basic definition to that. Unjust discrimination is basically unjust or prejudicial treatment of members of groups based on perceived association with that group. Discrimination is unjust or prejudicial treatment of members of groups based on perceived association with that group. In other words, it's when people see a group of people or an identifying characteristic against which they are going to give a prejudicial sort of judgment or treatment, and they see that in a person, and then without knowing anything else about that person, they discriminate against them on the basis of that. Basically, the discrimination takes forms in such forms that you are denying them certain social standing or social benefits based on their perceived association with this group. So that is unjust discrimination. Now, this particular definition of discrimination makes use of a couple of concepts that I want to define. Number one is justice. And for the purposes of talking about discrimination, justice is going to refer to fair treatment that is blind to irrelevant facts. Now, there may be treatment that has to take certain relevant facts into consideration, but when we talk about unjust discrimination, what that is saying is that there are facts that are irrelevant to the treatment, and people are still taking those facts into consideration. So justice is fair treatment that is blind to irrelevant facts. Prejudice is another term that we want to look at. Prejudice. And prejudice is to render premature judgment of something or someone. It's to render premature judgment of something or someone. Prejudice is premature because a person has not taken into consideration, has not invested the time or effort to take into consideration the judgment of whoever it is that they're judging. In other words, they're taking that irrelevant fact, and that's what their judgment is based on, rather than being based on something that is relevant to the situation. So going back to my example, when I was talking about the job interview that I had, the relevant fact upon which the judgment or the discrimination should have been based in order to be just was whether or not I could accomplish the task. Could I lift the bag or the box up to the shelf? That was the relevant fact. Now, if the person giving the interview was interviewing, let's say, for example, a female or a woman, and that person made the judgment, and the woman could, for the sake of argument, the woman could easily grab the box and put it up on the shelf. Then, and that person looked at the fact that it was a woman applying for the job as a relevant fact, or as a fact on which they were going to base their decision. Well, that fact wouldn't have been relevant to whether or not the person could complete the job. That would have been prejudice. That would have been an unjust form of discrimination. If the young lady would have come into the interviewee or interviewer's office, and the interviewer would have taken a look at her and said, "Well, it's just a girl. She's not going to be able to handle this job." If that was what was going on inside of his or her mind, that would have been prejudice. That would have been blind to the fact that she can accomplish the task just as easily as anybody else. So that would have been prejudice. So discrimination is the unjust, prejudicial treatment of members of groups based on a perceived association with that group. All right. Well, moving on from there, could you maybe think of a few forms or a few, issues that people look at when they're going to discriminate? I mean, talking about in our current context, what are some things that people discriminate on the basis of? What are some issues that are the subject of discrimination right now? Well, one of them that immediately pops out is that of race. Given our historical context in the United States of America, particularly as America was founded on the backs of slaves, who were people who were kidnapped and imported from Africa, and everything that unfolded throughout the history of America in slavery, we still have echoes of that racism that was endemic in our nation's founding, that are still endemic in our society today. And so race is continually an issue, and has been ever since our country's inception, even before that. But another one that even goes back further than that in some respects, not just our nation, but in the history of the world, is that of religion. People discriminating on the basis of religion. And so when different groups who believe, who are at odds in terms of what they worship or what they believe, can identify, they can identify, look at and identify people who practice a different religion, they tend to sometimes make assumptions based on what they've heard about that religion. They make assumptions about individuals who they perceive to be practitioners of that religion based on what they understand about the religion itself. Another one is gender. Across male and female lines, there are certain associations that surround whether a person, if a person is female, that person acts this way or behaves this way, will respond this way. If a person is male, that person will act and respond and behave this way. There are certain associations, and those are applied to every member of the group, even if they aren't necessarily true of every member of the group. Then there's that of sexuality. What is their sexual preferences? Their sexual, are they heterosexual? Are they homosexual, bisexual? And so on and so on. What does this person prefer that way? If that is known, if a person makes that known, and others can perceive or tell that about them, then certainly they sometimes will discriminate on the basis of that. Another one that's huge is that of appearance. Appearance, and this could be many things. Whether a man has a beard or not, whether a woman wears makeup or not, whether It could be, there are associations made with certain ways that people appear that may or may not be true, may or may not be valid. However, appearance is sort of one of those things. There are certain aspects of our appearance that we don't have any control over. Certainly, especially if a person has a physical deformity of some kind, and they have no ability to control, what they look like. However, sometimes our appearance is directly the result of a choice that we have made to look one way or another. And so, if I, for example, if I get all dressed up in a goth outfit, and I've got the pale skin, the black lipstick, the black eyeshadow, this kind of thing, and I go into, in certain contexts, I should not be surprised because I've chosen to look that way. I shouldn't be surprised if people are jumping to conclusions based on their experience with past people. Now, is that right or is that wrong? Well, my appearance in that case is a direct result of my personal beliefs, my personal choice. And so in some cases, our appearance can be a reflection of who we are inside. And if we are choosing to associate ourselves with a certain kind of look or a certain type of style, then we should not be surprised when people sort of make those assumptions. I remember when I was young, and I was probably 18, 19 years old. And I used to dress up hip hop style. I was in a rap group with a number of friends, and we produced rap music and things like that. But I was over at a friend's house, and we were just hanging out. We were actually watching Cops on TV, and my friend's girlfriend came over, was on her way over there, and she was coming up the stairs into the apartment when all of a sudden somebody ran out of another apartment, yelling and screaming some kind of a domestic incident was going on, and that it was a young man who ran down the stairs and smashed this window to the breezeway to their apartments. Well, when he did that, somebody called the police and had the police come out there, and the police came up to talk to my friend's girlfriend to take a statement. Well, my friend and I are sitting there watching TV, and the police come upstairs, and they're there to see her and talk to her. And one of them goes and talks to her. Well, his partner was there. He has this big old Maglite flashlight, and he turns it on and he shines it in my face and in my friend's face, and we're kind of blinded for a second. We don't know what's going on. What's going on? We're just watching Cops. We're watching a TV show, and he looks at us and he says, "Hey, you guys," he says, "you guys are a couple of gangbangers, aren't you?" And we're kind of like, what? We were not in a gang, affiliated with a gang. He says, but yeah, he says, you guys got those baseball hats on. They're on backwards. You guys are ready to rumble. You're in a gang, aren't you? And basically, because of what we had chosen to wear, this guy, and of course we were all kind of angry about it, but this police officer had made a generalization based on our appearance in order to make a profile of us, or make some assumptions about us. But we do that all the time. We discriminate on the basis of appearance. How about age? Do we discriminate on the basis of age? You hear this all the time, right? If that person is a boomer, or if that person is Gen Z or Gen X or a millennial, and of course there are certain things associated with all of those titles, and if we see a person who fits that age group, then that person is automatically assumed to have the characteristics of that age group. And so that is an assumption or an association that we make, a discrimination oftentimes that is made. That of disability. If a disability, the more prominent the disability is, people sometimes can make certain discriminations based on if they see a person that has a disability. I had a friend of mine who was in a car accident when he was young and in high school. He was permanently disabled because of that, and because he had some head trauma, and it affected the part of his brain that produced verbal. That produced his verbal skills, and so he was somewhat disabled in his ability to talk or to communicate. Now that led people to believe that he was slow mentally, or that he was and so you would see people talking to him like he was a little kid sometimes. The problem was that my friend had no incapacitation in terms of his ability to process things mentally. He was able to think well and reason well, and whenever he had the ability to take the time to write and think through what he was going to say, you would not have been able to tell that he was disabled in any way. It's just that whenever he would talk to you, this disability was evident. But people made the assumption that because he had this speech impediment or this speech disability, that for some reason his mind wasn't clear and some reason he wasn't able to think. But that was wrong, and that was a discrimination. That was on the basis of that. Well, another one is attractiveness. People make certain assumptions or certain discriminations on the basis of how attractive you might be. This goes back kind of with appearance. If a person perceives you as attractive, or you can think maybe in the realm of a person's weight. People discriminate on the basis of weight and how much, whether a person is skinny or athletic or obese or anything like that. They make certain assumptions based on those things as well, and discriminate on the basis of those things. Ethnicity, and this is somewhat like race, however, it has a little bit more culture bound up in it, because people of a similar racial group can vary widely when it comes to ethnicity, what kind of culture they're from. And certain discriminations are made against people. For example, you see Middle Eastern people, oftentimes women in particular, wearing hijabs or something, and they'll the headscarf, and all of a sudden, whenever people see that, certain discriminations are brought against them. Social status. If a person is perceived to be, depending on what their social status might be, that's another reason that people discriminate. Political affiliation. If you see somebody wearing a MAGA hat, all of a sudden you've got some certain things that people are assuming about them. A person's speech or their ability to talk. We mentioned that a minute ago. How they talk, what colloquialisms they use, maybe what accent they might have, something of that nature. Oftentimes, a Southern accent is associated with someone who is uneducated, when that couldn't be further from the truth. If a person has an accent, It really has no bearing on how educated or how intelligent that they are. A person's job. People discriminate on the basis of what kind of job a person has. And so if you say, hey, I work at, I'm a plumber versus, hey, I'm an executive, people have certain associations with either of those things, and the idea is that, okay, being a plumber is a blue collar job. It's a trade. It's something that doesn't require a lot of skill, a lot of intelligence, whereas being an executive does, and it's a white collar job, and there's more money and all this sort of thing. When that may not actually be true. In fact, in many cases, plumbers make a whole lot more money than executives do, and actually have better job security, because plumbing is always going to go wrong. And so and then people don't want to get into plumbing, and so the person who's a plumber might have it made. Economic status, how much money or how much wealth a person is perceived as having, that also can lead to discrimination and so forth. So there are a lot of things. I mean, let's face it, as a society, we are a very discriminating society. We discriminate against people on the basis of a number of things. Now, a lot of this might arise out of what you might call a survival instinct, right? Because let's face it, the world is kind of a dangerous place. Going back to the police officer who was confronting my friend and myself, that man, probably he was an older man, so he probably had served on the force where he had seen people dressed similarly to me do all kinds of untold, terrible, evil things. And so when he saw us, he just thought in his mind, well, these two guys are just the same sort of people as them. And that was a survival instinct for him, most likely, because if he didn't think that way, if he gave carte blanche trust in everybody that he ever met, that could wind up being very tragic for him if he didn't keep his guard up. And so in some cases, it could be sort of a survival instinct to this discrimination and this sort of thing. but certainly not seeking to justify it, just seeking to understand it. That may be how it develops initially, but oftentimes this discrimination doesn't just stay at the survival instinct, right? To the point where, okay, you see a person, you've made this discrimination, but then once you get to know them, well, then you get to understand them, and we allow those walls to come down. That's ideally what might happen, but there are cases, in fact, a lot of cases, where that discriminating factor, whatever it is that we're discriminating against, we allow that to be the single largest number one influencer of how we process our thinking about other people. And so it's not like we see them, we meet them, we get to know them, we overcome our prejudice. Rather than that, it's we see them, our prejudice prevents us from being able to even interact or give a fair assessment of them or get to know them at all. And that's where there's that wall there that just prevents us from getting to know people that way. And unfortunately, that wall that takes place in individual relationships then can be sort of pushed out or turned outward into a societal or institutional level, so that it's no longer a case of individual discrimination. Rather, it's a case where enough individuals have gotten together and the discrimination has become sort of an embedded fabric in our society. Now, when that happens, this is known as institutional or structural discrimination. Institutional or structural discrimination. And institutional discrimination is when social structures and institutions are set up in ways that are oppressive or produce unequal outcomes. When social structures and institutions are set up in ways that are oppressive or produce unequal outcomes. Now, to give an example of this, I have a video clip here that is from the movie Selma, and it's a great movie. It's a very good sort of portrayal of the life and the efforts of the civil rights movement, particularly of Martin Luther King Jr. But anyway, there are a lot of things to be learned from it. But in this particular clip, there's a woman who's played by Oprah Winfrey, and she's going to the county clerk's office in order to try to get registered to vote. Now, back in those days, what they had were laws called Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws were laws that were set up that were embedded in society that enforced segregation between black people and white people. And because of that, and then in order to keep those laws in place, basically white people in the South would prevent black people from gaining any sort of political influence or any sort of power to change things politically. So anyway, she's getting ready to go and register to vote, and in order to do that, she has to pass a political or a historical knowledge exam, which was up to the clerk to be able to dispense. Now, the notion was, hey, a person, this is the idea that usually that is sold on, right? The idea is that, hey, this person, if we're going to have a person voting and participating in our society, then they must have a sort of knowledge of how our society or civilization functions. Because if they don't, then they're going to get in there, they're going to be able to vote, they're going to be able to have a voice on how society runs when they have no idea how it is. So that's how the idea of a knowledge exam gets passed into law. That's the justification that is used in order to pass it. Well, here what we have is this county clerk talking to this, who's a white man, talking to this black woman and administering to her his idea of a test, a political knowledge test. Let's take a look at it.
You work for Mr. Dunn down at the rest home, ain't that right?
Yes, sir.
Wonder what old Dunn will say when I tell him one of his gals down here stirring a fuss.
I ain't stirring no fuss. I'm just here trying to register to vote.
Recite the Constitution's preamble. You know what a preamble is?
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
How many county judges in Alabama?
67.
Name them.
So what you see here is an example of institutional racism or institutional discrimination in effect, right? Because the law is set up in such a way that it allows for discrimination. The law is set up in such a way that it discriminates against people of color who should have an equal voice to anyone else in society, and yet they can't because of this law, which was sold on the idea of trying to produce an educated electorate. Nevertheless, because of who is currently in power, maintaining their power, it is unfairly administered, so as to make sure that the people that they want to continue to oppress continue to be oppressed. Now, not every instance of institutional racism is so obvious and so overt. Most of the time, in fact, institutional racism or cases of institutional racism and discrimination sort of fly under the radar, and they are not very perceptible unless you're the one being discriminated against. And so, for example, when I was going to college and I was getting ready to go to college, I remember I had to take the SAT test, which I think pretty much most of you might have done something similar, or maybe you took an entrance exam to a particular college here. Maybe you took the entrance exam here. Anyway, there's some sort of assessment that has to be taken. Well, when I was going to college, it was the SAT. That's all we pretty much had. We had a PSAT, but then the SAT was what really counted. And so we would go and we would take this, but the problem is that the SAT was formulated in such a way that it favored people of majority culture. And so it might have a question that related, let's say, to the Pilgrims. And unless you were an American who had lived in America and grown up in America and participated in the celebration of Thanksgiving and understood a little bit of the culture behind all of that, then if you're going to write an essay on the Pilgrims, for example, then you would not have had firsthand knowledge of that from the culture. You would have had to have depended maybe on a textbook or something. So if you were, let's say, a student who had just moved to the United States, you'd only been here 2 or 3 years, and you really had not you'd not examined things, you had not looked into them as much, you had not had those cultural cues, you would probably do worse on the test. Now, think about that example for just a minute. The test was formulated in such a way that it produced a better outcome for those who were innately American, who are natively American. They were born here and raised here. So it produced an unequal outcome that favored them. It created an advantage for them. But the creators of the SAT in those days, they were not thinking to themselves, well, how do we go about making sure that only Americans can do well on this test? That wasn't their intention at all. They were just sort of not thinking about it. They were products of their own culture, and so they wrote the test in such a way that it reflected their cultural bias in a sense. It wasn't an overt conscious way of discriminating. Nevertheless, it did produce discrimination. And so, like I was saying, sometimes cases of institutional or structural discrimination fly under the radar. They don't get immediately. They're not immediately evident, and so they can be very, very hard to confront, very hard to combat. But that's what institutional discrimination, structural discrimination is. Now, what I would like to do now is sort of shift gears a little bit. Because there are so many, how should we say it? Because there are so many various different things against which people discriminate in our culture, I want to hone in on one that is more or less a what might be considered an archetype in our cultural situation for discrimination. And that is the issue of racism. Now, racism is not the only form of discrimination. There's all kinds of others. But racism, since it has been such a part of our culture and context, it might be a helpful guide into seeing how other forms of discrimination sort of crop up. And given our space and time limitations, we don't have time to get into all of them. But anyhow, we'll take a look at racism as such. Now, racism is basically the discrimination against someone on the basis of perceived racial characteristics. Racism is the unjust discrimination against someone based on perceived racial characteristics. And the first thing I'd like for us to consider is, what are those racial characteristics? What are these racial characteristics against which people who are going to be racist, what do they discriminate on the basis of? What are the things that are so different about a group of people that they must be sort of heralded, they must be pulled out, they must be accentuated as a mode of discrimination? Well, if you get down to it, here's the thing: it's not language, because although people of different races vary by language, you can have people of different races within the same language group. And so it's not exactly language, even though it might be related to that. It certainly can be. Racism is also not discrimination on the basis of culture, strictly speaking. Because there can be people who are of different cultures, people who are of American culture, and who are of a different race, and the racist will still see them. They'll see that they're dressed as an American, maybe in a suit and tie and everything else, but that person, the racist, is still going to discriminate against them, not on the basis of culture, but on the basis of race. Now, what are those racial characteristics? Well, I want to submit to you that those racial characteristics that sort of narrowly define what racism is are very few, actually. For example, some of those characteristics that we encompass under the word race include things like skin color. Skin color is a designation, it will designate a person as one race or another. That's not the only thing, but that's certainly one thing. Maybe hair color or hair texture is another indicator of someone's racial affinity. Eye color and eye shape would also be that. There are also other facial features, nose shape and the shape of the mouth and the size of the mouth also are an indicator of a racial characteristic against which racist people often discriminate. Certain body builds or certain body types that are associated with those other racial characteristics. But we're getting a little bit far afield here. But that's generally it. There really isn't a whole lot more. Back when Adolf Hitler was around, he had a group of scientists known as the Ahnenabra. And one of the jobs of the Ahnenabra was to go into various cultures of the world, and they were to do what was known as anthropic measurements. Anthropic measurements. And what anthropic measurements were was basically the scientists would come into a village or a town or something like that, and they would look at the people, and they would have a set of swatches, and they would go and they would compare the swatches, the different shades on the swatches, against the skin color of the people who were in that village or in that town or that city. And they would get a rough estimate about what was the average skin shade among the people here. Then they would do the same thing with the hair color. And then they would talk about, and then there would be sort of a list of, well, what texture is the hair? Is it straight? Is it wavy? Is it curly? They would go and they would measure, they would just take measurements of, for example, the length of a person's femur, or the length of a person's arms, the length of a person's hand and their fingers and this sort of thing. They would go in and they would take plaster casts of people's faces, so that an average facial structure of that people in that society or the people of that race were to have. Now, why did they do this? Well, they were trying to use these characteristics that we've just mentioned as a basis for which to divide people out into racial groups. We'll talk more about why that was in just a moment. But that's what they did. They identified these racial markers, and they're really, really very few. There's not a lot of them. Okay, so, well, the Anunnaki did that. These are the characteristics that oftentimes people who discriminate on the basis of race will utilize in their discrimination. Now, the question, though, that I have for us to consider is, where do we get this idea of race? That a person's race is somehow related to their skin color. Where do we get the idea that a person's race is related to their eye shape? Where do we get the idea that a person's race is related to the length of the femur or the length of the arms? Where do we get the idea that race is related to one's hair color or texture? Where does this idea come from? And this is a kind of a project I worked on with another Ivy Tech professor who was a history professor. This has been back, I think, in 2015. He and I were teaching in the same program for ASAP, and we were tasked with kind of overlapping our content. And so we were to find areas in each one of our curriculum where we could cross over. And so I could talk about historical things in my course as it relates to ethics, and he could talk about ethical things in his course as it related to history. And there are a lot of those, actually, a lot of instances. But one of the areas that we actually focused in on was this notion of race. And historically speaking, what was the development of the idea of race, which is the set of characteristics against which racist people in the United States discriminate on the basis of. And so what I have to talk about now really is a direct result of that study. Now, where do we get the idea of race in our society? Well, in 1859, and it goes back earlier than this, but in 1859, there was something that happened that really presented the thinking of Western civilization as a people. It presented their thinking on this topic of race. And what happened then was the publication of a book called The Origin of the Species by Natural Selection. This was a book that was published by Charles Darwin. You're probably familiar with this book. It's the book that really gave rise to the modern development of the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution had been around since the ancient days, since way back in the days of Greek philosophy. The one thing that it really lacked, though, to keep it from being sort of presented as science, was what was a mechanism by which this evolution took place. Why in the world does evolution need to happen? Why do things change? We knew that they did change, but what gave direction to that change, and what was the purpose for it? Well, Darwin's theory did that, and that's the second part of the title, right? Origin of the Species by means of natural selection. Natural selection, theorized Charles Darwin, natural selection was the motor of evolution. And you're familiar with the concept of natural selection by now, I'm sure. Natural selection is the idea of the survival of the fittest. And this is the idea that in any given context, the environment of the world presents a set of challenges to any organism that is going to live there. In certain organisms that possess characteristics or qualities or traits that make their chances of survival favorable in that context, are going to be at a better advantage of passing on their genes to the next generation, so that the next generation then will exhibit those same characteristics and qualities. Those who don't possess those qualities that are more favorable for survival in that context, they're going to die out, and they're not going to send their characteristics into the next generation. And then so over successive generations, various animals will evolve through this process as genetic information is sort of reshuffled and weeded out, and this sort of thing, to make the organism there more adapted to that particular context. That's what natural selection is. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that the subtitle for Charles Darwin's book is this. It's the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of the favored races in the struggle for life. The preservation of the favored races in the struggle for life. You see, Darwin saw these various stages, or these various characteristics or qualities in a given context that allowed them to survive better. Darwin saw these as different races. That's the name that he gave to them. That's the name that he used to understand this. So there were different races, let's say, for example, of turtles. And in a given context, this race of turtles were favored for survival in this context. And so that's why all the turtles in this context look like this, right? Whereas over here, the turtles in this context, because of the way it is, they exhibit different traits, even though they're still turtles. Maybe they have longer necks or something of that nature. They exhibit different traits because the challenges in this context are different. And so that's the reason behind these different races, according to Darwin. Life was a struggle, and these different races of different organisms had to survive through means of natural selection. Now, in Origin of the Species, like I said, that was published in 1859. In Origin of the Species, not a whole lot was said about human evolution. Darwin lived and did his work at a time where to come out and say that human beings evolved from some lower life form would have been totally laughed at by the science, both the scientific and the philosophical, the theological minds of the day, because back then the overwhelming thought was this notion that all things had been designed by God and directly created by God. And so this certain group of individuals was directly created like that, whereas this certain group of individuals were directly created like that, and God created them, each one different. There was no sort of changing from one to the next or anything like that. Well, he didn't apply it to humans at first, because that would have been probably unthinkable. But what he did do was he applied that to all other various types of biological life. And then at the very end of his book, in the closing sections of his book, what he does is he sort of ruminates. He starts to think, if natural selection, if that were applied to other fields of study, what would that look like? And he begins to think about that. And he begins to think about how that might look if applied to geology, how that might look if applied to economics. And he talks about psychology, human psychology. And this is what he has to say in the back of his book about human psychology. He says, in the future, I see open fields for far more important researches. And he's talking about how the theory of natural selection might be applied to these researches. He says psychology will be securely based on the foundation already well laid by Mr. Herbert Spencer, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Much light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Now you see what he's saying here. He's saying, look, I believe that in the future, if we continue down this road and we continue to look and use this theory of natural selection, we apply it to psychology, for example, and we ask the question of why are human beings so much more intellectually developed than lower animals, right? So than less developed intellectually animals, lower primates or something. He says, I believe what we'll find is that human beings evolved out of a certain gradation whereby we acquired each mental power that we have by slow increments, leading to the place where we are now. So that's what he surmised anyway. That's what he speculated on. And then this last sentence, he says, he believes that in that time, in that case, much light will be thrown on the origin of man and on his history. So the history will be illuminated. The origin of human race. The human race would be illuminated, but he doesn't do that in 1859. Well, later on, what he does is he goes. That happens, and he goes on about his business for the next decade and a half or so, and promotes the idea of the idea of evolution. It starts to gain traction, gain ground, and then later on he publishes another book. This book is called The Descent of Man. The Descent of Man was published in 1871. By this time, Darwin's theory had taken hold in scientific realm, or the scientific realm in circles. And now he was ready to apply what he believed about natural selection to human evolution rather than just to evolution of other animals and sort of the small changes that takes place. Rather, now he wants to take and apply evolution to large changes that took place within the human species. So here's what he says. At the end of his book, he's dealing with the objection. Right, we've all seen this particular picture, and this picture represents a common objection to Darwin's theory in that day. This picture shows on the one end of the spectrum a lower primate, from which an ape-like primate, from which human beings were thought to have evolved. And then various intermediary steps between that lower primate and human beings. But what there seems to be, in Darwin's day, the gap was far wider. What there seems to be is this gap, or this missing link, if you will, that fails to account for transitions that might have happened between, say, Australopithecus africanus and Neanderthal man or Cro-Magnon man. And so these gaps were very large and very apparent. And so he's trying to offer an explanation of why these gaps are there and what will happen in the future in relationship to these gaps. And this is what he says about these gaps. He says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. So what he's saying is that as time goes on, those savage races of man are not fit for survival, and they are either replaced or exterminated by the more civilized races of man. And as that happens, a gap should be expected to intervene. There should be a gap between the lower forms and the higher forms. And then he goes on to say, at that time, or at the same time, anthropomorphous apes, and what he means by that are apes that are more man-like. Anthro is man, morph means the shape of. So anthropomorphous ape refers to the apes that have more of a human characteristic. He says, at the same time, anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider. So he says, look, this gap, it should be exactly what we expect. And in fact, it's going to get wider than it is even now. He says, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian. So here he's talking about the Caucasian being a civilized man, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. And by Australian, what he's talking about there is the Australian Aborigine, not Australians who were colonizing Australia at the time. He's talking about native Australians. And so, do you see what he's saying there, though? Going back to this picture, going back to the picture that we saw, what Darwin is getting at is that he believes that the reason that certain human beings possess certain characteristics, like darker skin, different textures of hair, and so forth, he believed that the reason that people possess that is because they were that particular race of human beings was in a lower state in terms of human evolution than the Caucasian. He believed that the Caucasian in his day was the most civilized, was sort of the pinnacle of human evolution, and other races of human beings, which going back from that represented certain stages in evolution of different stages that we have moved on from. That's what he's getting at in The Descent of Man. And so back to the original question, in our culture's concept of race, why do people identify certain markers as attributes or characteristics from which to base racial distinctions or racial discrimination? Well, this really was a movement that took hold during the latter part of the 19th century on into the 20th century. The notion that the Caucasian Western civilization was more civilized, and because Caucasians were themselves more highly evolved than people of color. And people of color represent steps toward mankind in a less evolved state. That was the commonly held notion, and back then it was not controversial to even talk about that. It was something that was simply accepted as scientific proof or scientific fact, as it were, rather. And so that was common knowledge. Now that gave, or common belief, I should say, that gave rise to what is known as the eugenics movement. Now, the term eugenics literally means good birth. It comes from the Greek word genao, and the prefix eu meaning good. So eugenics means good birth. Genao meaning birth or generation. And so eugenics means good birth. Now there was all kinds of people involved in. There were all kinds of people involved in the eugenics movement. Now, what the eugenics movement was in favor of doing was adopting public policy in education such that we could promote the proliferation of certain groups of people and promote the non-proliferation of others. And so those who were deemed to have good genes were then encouraged to continue on in this pattern of creating others, the next generation, with even better genes. Whereas those who were considered dysgenic, or people who had bad genes, were discouraged from proliferating. And this is why segregation was such an important thing in those days, because it was considered people with bad genes. You didn't want them intermixing with people with good genes, because that would devolve the species, so to speak. So eugenicists promoted this. Eugenicists like a woman named Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger lived in the early 1900s, or did most of her work in the early to mid 1900s. Margaret Sanger was a prolific eugenicist. She founded a magazine or a periodical known as Birth Control Review, and the idea was that certain segments of the population should be able to have very open access to birth control, so as to prevent their proliferation, prevent them from continuing to reproduce. And here's what she says. This comes from April 1932. In her book, in her magazine, Birth Control Review. This is an article that she wrote, and this is what she says. She says, "We should apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is tainted." So this is dysgenic people. We need to apply a rigid policy of sterilization and segregation. Let's see. She says to those people in the population whose progeny is tainted, or whose inheritance is such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring. So she's talking about, let's identify those people of dysgenic populations, and let's sterilize them, or let's segregate them so that they do not infiltrate those populations of people with eugenic traits. She goes on to say, give dysgenic groups, that is people with the bad genes, give dysgenic groups in our population their choice of segregation or sterilization. Segregation means that you need to stop hanging around, stop interacting with people of the higher evolved status, with people who have better genes, because we don't want you intermixing with them. And that way they can go on to promote human evolution. This will be best for society. Or if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to stop intermingling with them, then you can choose always to be sterilized, and that way you cannot have a chance of reproducing with them. Now, So who are the dysgenic groups, Mrs. Sanger? So who are these people who that you consider their traits objectionable? Well, this is from a letter that she wrote in 1939 to Dr. Clarence Gamble of Procter & Gamble, who she was talking about some of her plans, and this is what she says. She says, we should hire 3 or 4 colored ministers, preferably with a social service background and with engaging personalities. The most successful educational approach to the Negro is through the religious appeal, and we don't want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. So, okay, Sanger, so what do you want to do? Well, I want to segregate and sterilize. I don't want intermingling. I don't want intermixing. Well, who then are the dysgenic people? Well, she's just said who she thinks the dysgenic people are. Sanger was a well-known eugenicist. She was one who, in her birth control review and in her efforts, she put her theories into practice. You may have heard her name. But Margaret Sanger, when I say she put her theories into practice, her theories that certain groups should be sterilized, certain groups should be given birth control, she put that to practice by forming an organization that you probably at least have heard of. That organization is Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood. And now you say, okay, well, what does that have to do with racism, or what does that have to do with eugenics? Well, Planned Parenthood initially started as an effort to try to control the population of what she considered dysgenic populations. And she marketed her efforts at birth control toward people in those groups, these groups that she identified as dysgenic. In fact, she did so much in those days that even today, 78% of Planned Parenthood clinics are located in minority communities. They are in minority communities. Even today, black people account for 12% of the population, but account for around 35% of the abortions. So this presents a huge disparity. Today, a black woman is 600% more likely to have an abortion than a white woman. And in certain places, New York City being among them, more black pregnancies are aborted than are carried to term and delivered. This is all statistical fact. You can look it up and Google it on the internet. And even today, Planned Parenthood, if you go to their sites, even today, Planned Parenthood sort of tilts their marketing strategies toward people of minority status. So that's even a sort of a carryover from today, or to today. But we see that in throughout history. And this was not something that was that people were shy about in those days. This is something that was on the surface. This was something that people taught. In fact, in a generation earlier than that, in 1925, what we find is that there is there's a court case that happens. In fact, they called it the trial of the century. That was in 1925. It was known as the Scopes trial. Now, the Scopes trial on the surface was a trial about the teaching of evolution in public schools. Because in Tennessee in those days, it was illegal to teach that people evolved from lower primates. It was illegal to teach the theory of evolution in schools. Now, biology textbooks came with a section on evolution in them, but Tennessee teachers were not allowed to teach that section. Well, the ACLU in Tennessee decided that they wanted to have a test case, and they wanted to have a go at this law and try to see if they couldn't get it shut down or kicked out or something of that nature. And so what they did was they got a hold of a substitute teacher whose last name was Scopes. And they said, hey, look, here's what we want to do. We want you to go into the class and we want you to teach evolution. And when you teach evolution, we're going to have a sheriff standing there waiting to see you teach evolution. And he's going to arrest you for doing that. They're going to take you to jail, and then we'll bail you out. and then we will go to trial with this thing. We'll take this thing to trial in order to test the laws of the state of Tennessee on teaching of evolution. Now, history, like if you in modern culture, if you hear at all about the Scopes trial, what you'll hear, because there were books written on it. There was a movie written. A movie that was made called "Inherit the Wind," that was made in reference to that. It was really a big to-do. When the trial happened, there was a lot of people. There were all kinds of people, newspapers, media, people drawing pictures, all kinds of people there at the trial in order to capture this trial of the century. And typically, when it's remembered in history books, it is remembered as a trial that was trying to test the validity of teaching evolution versus creation, which is what many taught back then was the biblical story of creation. So it was seen as a watershed moment in history of this battle between faith and reason, or science and religion, that kind of thing. That's what it's often remembered as. But rarely do people ask the question, why was it that people of faith didn't want evolution taught in school? Was it because it just contradicted the theory of a creation? Because there were also many ideas back then that were sort of floating around that tried to harmonize evolution and creation from a Christian perspective. So I don't think that was it. In fact, given some of the historical proceedings, or the records of the court proceedings and such, I believe that the reason that people did not want evolution taught in high schools in those days is because of some of these eugenic consequences that came out of it. For example, the book that was in question that Scopes took and started teaching in there, the book was called A Civic Biology. A Civic Biology was a book by George William Hunter, and this was the book that they used in 1925 to teach biology to the students in Tennessee state schools. Now, in the section on evolution, right, if you turn to that section on evolution, let me read an excerpt for you about what that said. It says this. It says, at the present time there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from one another in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure, talking about the structure of the body. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. That was taught word for word, verbatim, in a high school textbook in 1925 in the state of Tennessee and other places as well. And I would submit to you, given the sort of fervor that engendered, and the racism and the division that engendered because of eugenics in those days, that the reason that people like Williams Jennings Bryan, which was the defense attorney for the state of Tennessee, the reason that they did not want this taught in school was not because it presented an alternative religion, but rather it presented eugenics. In eugenics, the natural outflow and consequence of eugenics was racism and societal division and hatred. And so that was really what it was all about. Now, the ACLU saw it as a dig on the church and on Christianity and in trying to get a more secularized state. But when you brought all of that in there, when you brought the evolutionary idea as it was presented back then, that carried with it some implications about people of different races. Now, so the idea that these things compose, these racial characteristics compose dysgenic or less evolved traits, then has fed into our current cultural situation. Because, that may have been 100 years ago. In some cases, not even. But 100 years really is not time to completely wash out of living memory the concept or the ideas of a worldview, of a society. And so what we have today, even though the theory of evolution no longer teaches that teaches evolution taking place in that way. Even though people in many ways don't connect the dots back to this idea that some people are more evolved, some people are less evolved. Nevertheless, the racial prejudices that carry over from one generation to the next are still very present. I mean, we're only, 3 or 4 generations removed from a society where it was perfectly acceptable to start talking about people as if they were lower life forms. That doesn't go away overnight, and the cultural memory of that doesn't go away overnight, and the practices that have evolved of the institutions of society and the power structures of society, that doesn't go away, and it hasn't gone away, and in some cases even persists today. That's kind of where we get our idea of race in our culture, and it's always good to know those things, so that we can then critique, okay, is my discrimination, is it justifiable? Is it justifiable on the basis of modern science even? Or is it justifiable on the basis of what I believe to be true about the world? So anyway, that's where we get our concept of race and why people many times are racist. That's how embedded it is in our culture. Now, we at the beginning of this lecture, we touched on a number of various items against which people discriminate. The challenge, so we've got race, we've got religion, we've got sex, we've got sex or gender, or we've got sexuality and all kinds of things like that, and a whole bunch of other ones that we listed out at the beginning of this lecture. The challenge is, how do we come together with a single principle that encompasses all of these things and brings them together, and how do we come up with that? Your book presents a principle known as the principle of equality. The principle of equality. And the principle of equality is just simply an effort to try and come up with a way of deciding when certain things are just, when are they unjust. When is discrimination just? When is it unjust? And the principle of equality says this, basically. It says, it is unjust to treat people differently in ways that deny to some of them significant social benefits, unless we can show that there is a difference between them that is relevant to the difference of treatment. Now that's a mouthful. Let me say it again. It is unjust to treat people differently in ways that deny to some of them significant social benefits, unless we can show that there is a difference between them and that the difference is relevant to the difference in treatment. Now, to break it down, basically the principle of equality is asking 2 questions. Number one, when we're talking about discriminating between 2 people, number one, is there a difference between them? Inevitably, there's always a difference between 2 people, but is there a difference that is weighing on the topic? And number 2, is that difference relevant to the difference in treatment? Is it relevant to the difference in treatment? Is there a difference between people, and is that difference relevant to the difference in treatment? Let's take these and sort of flesh them out. Okay, so let's imagine that I'm an HR person, human resources person, and I'm going to go and decide. I've got 2 candidates who are sitting there in front of me, and I'm going to decide between them who gets the job, right? Well, let's say that the job is the job is a clerical position. It's let's say that the job is a clerical position, and I'm going to decide between these 2 applicants which one I believe is to be better to do the job. Now, let's say that one of them is a man and one of them is a woman, and as I'm interviewing them, both of them have great work experience. Both of them have great. They come across great personalities, very positive, seem to be very go-getters, upbeat, this sort of thing. They both are very well qualified. They have good education. They seem to be very knowledgeable on all of the things that they will need in order to be able to do the job. Let's say that, however, the woman has just a little bit more education than the man, but so there's that. Okay, so let's say she's got maybe a few more credentials, a few more certificates, that sort of thing. But let's say that I, as the HR person, I've got to make the call. Now, if I make the call on the basis of I'm going to hire the woman because she has more education, everything else, these two are stunningly equal. But I'm going to hire the woman because she has a better education. I mean, that's all really I have to go on at this point. Then that would be a difference between them that is a little bit, that is more relevant to the actual job that is going to happen. And because that difference is relevant to the job that I'm hiring them for, I could justifiably say that discrimination between them is justified. I could say that I'm justified in hiring the woman because she has a better education than the man. She's got more certificates and so forth. However, if I hire the man because, you know what, I just want another guy around the office. I don't like working with women. And so I'm just going to hire the man because he's a man. And I believe that men are the ones maybe that should be, earning the money for the family or whatever. But I make the point of discrimination between them on that basis. Well, then that really doesn't have anything to do with their job, with how well they'll be able to do their job. And that doesn't really have anything to do with the job itself or our company or anything like that. And so that would be a case of where there is a difference between them, but the difference is not relevant to the difference in treatment. So that would be a case of how the principle of equality might be applied in order to try to tell when a case of discrimination might be justified. Now, are there any problems with the principle of equality? Well, I'm going to say that yes, there are. And the main problem of the principle of equality, I think it has to do with this. Who gets to decide whether the treatment or the difference between the two people is relevant to the difference in treatment? Who gets to decide that? Let's take another situation that might illustrate it. And that might illustrate some competing interests here as well. Let's say, for example, that I am on the resource or the human resources committee of a church, a ministry, and our church is growing and it's getting bigger, and we are looking to hire a secretary. And we have two candidates that we've been interviewing. They both seem to be very, very good, and very well qualified. Really, there's no reason not to hire either one of them. But in the course of the interview, we find out that one of the people, one of the ladies who is interviewing for this particular position, is a homosexual. The other one is not. She's a married heterosexual woman. So on the one hand, there's a homosexual woman. On the other hand, a heterosexual woman. Now, is there a difference between those two? Well, yeah, there's a difference. One's homosexual, one's heterosexual. Now, the question is that difference relevant to the difference in treatment? So as an HR person of the church, and we're not hiring for a ministry position. It's not a pastor or a Bible teacher or anything like that. This is for secretarial. This is for an office capacity, a clerical work. So would that person be justified in discriminating against the homosexual person and hiring the heterosexual just because of that particular difference? Well, now, some people would say no, because their sexual orientation doesn't really come into play when it is, when it has to do with how well they do their job. On the other hand, there might be those who would say that yes, the church is justified in discriminating against a person based on their sexual orientation, particularly if that church has had a history, or the tradition has had a history of objection to that particular lifestyle. So which one is it going to be? Is it just or is it not? Is it justified or is it not? Which one of those? Who gets to determine whether the principle of equality actually meets is represented here? Is it the church? Because if it's the church that decides what criteria is relevant for discrimination, that's going to be much different than, let's say, someone who is not religiously minded, who might see this as an example of unjustified discrimination. Again, who gets to decide what constitutes the difference that is relevant to the differential treatment. That's the primary problem with the principle of equality. There's no real basis for determining that. Well, as we continue on, there are many other issues related to the issue of discrimination that fall under this category. I'll just mention a few real quick because this particular lecture is getting a little bit long. But for example, profiling is an issue that falls under this category. And of course, profiling is the idea that a person is presumed guilty of a crime because of the basically what they look like. So it's treating someone as suspect based on their appearance. Now there are two different categories of profiling. Profiling on the one hand, there's hard profiling. And hard profiling is when someone profiles on the basis of race alone. So that would be hard profiling. And then there's soft profiling, which is profiling when someone profiles on the basis of several characteristics. Race might be one of those, but also there may be clothing or mannerisms or speech or something like that. So the whole sort of presentation of that person goes into what is being categorized as being profiled against. So the question is profiling wrong? Certainly, it comes in handy for law enforcement who have to basically triage a situation where they're looking for a suspect and a person meets the certain appearance or fits the description and then a person who's law enforcement might profile that person just as a means of trying to weed out from everyone else who that person might be. So sometimes it's very useful in that situation, and many times in law enforcement, for example, you might see like an FBI person putting together a composite profile or a psychological profile of someone, and a psychological profile is used much in the same way. It's used to try to identify when a person, or identify a sort of profile of people so as to narrow down the potential suspects and give investigators a lead to go on. Certainly can be very useful, but then again, profiling can be very unjust as well. There was a case a few years back where a man who, quote unquote, fit the description was pulled over of a man who conducted an armed robbery. He was pulled over, and he was one thing led to another, and he was actually killed because the officer who was conducting the stop was new, relatively untrained, and very nervous about it. It ended up shooting the man to death. And that's a tragedy. It's a terrible, horrible tragedy because he fit the profile or fit the description. So profiling can have very, very negative impacts. Then there's the issue of hate crimes. Hate crimes is another one of these things, issues that you can file under discrimination. And hate crimes are basically crimes that are committed, and they're usually violent in nature, that are motivated in part or in whole from a bias. And so a person hates a particular group, hates a particular profile, and they begin to target the people, members of that group, or people that they perceive to be members of that group, as a target of violence, and that has unfortunately been the case in our society. But the question remains, though, if we're going to talk about hate crimes, how do we do that? How do we justify punishing someone based on the motivation for their crime? So should there be extra punishment for crimes that are motivated out of bias? And if that's the case, how do you know what a person's bias is? Or how do you know what motivated that person in that particular instance? Maybe they do have a bias against people of that group, but that particular crime wasn't motivated out of bias. It was simply motivated out of opportunity or something of that nature. That would be a very difficult point in hate crimes legislation, is trying to prove that a person was in enacting that particular instance of crime was motivated out of hatred, because there's no way that you and I can dig inside one another's mind to see exactly what it is that motivates us. Also, it would be tantamount to discriminating, putting into law discrimination against discrimination. In other words, you are saying that if a person is racist, for example, then that person is a worse kind of criminal than a person who is non-racist. Never mind the fact that whether they were racist or not, the same violent act could be performed with the same consequences and the same fallout. Isn't that punishing someone's opinion? As vile as we might think racism is, don't we also have a First Amendment right? If somebody wants to be racist, don't we have a right to do that? Some people might say, no, people don't have a right to be racist toward others. But hold on a second. At what point do once we start eroding that First Amendment right to believe whatever it is that you want to believe, where do we stop that erosion? And what happens when that erosion comes to your door and starts discriminating against you or starts punishing you for opinions that you hold? That's the slippery slope that we get on if we start punishing hate crimes. And punishing them as such. So there's profiling, there are hate crimes. Another issue related to that of discrimination is the whole concept of affirmative action. Affirmative action. Now, affirmative action is the idea that we should give preferential treatment of some kind to a specific group because that group has endured past discrimination in our culture. Some might call this reparations, and in some cases it would be designated as reparations. But affirmative action is when we give preferential treatment to a certain group who has experienced past discrimination. Some examples of this might be, I know of a college out on the West Coast that historically was built on Native American burial grounds, lands that were sacred to Native Americans. Now that college has been in operation for decades, but now here recently, and I say recently, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that college recognizes that their grounds occupy this traditional Native American burial ground, and rather than actually moving the college, right? Rather than doing that, what they chose to do instead was they offer free tuition for anyone who has a certain percentage of Native American background, and so people who have Native American heritage can go there for free, tuition free, because of this past discrimination. They're now giving them preferential treatment. But the idea here, in most cases, is that past discrimination has a generationally compounding effect, so that present descendants of those groups who are at a disadvantage when compared to those who are not members of those groups. So, for example, just 3, 4, 5 generations ago, when slavery was still legal in this nation, people who were African descendants didn't own any property, couldn't own any property, couldn't even get really married permanently unless they were freed, and even then didn't have any rights. And so in order for them to get to make their way in the world and own property and all this sort of thing, in order for them to get ahead in the world, they had to struggle and scrape. And even if they did that, there was no rights of inheritance to pass it on to the next generation. So there was this generational inequity between them, whereas people of majority culture were able to compound generationally. That's a possibility, to compound their wealth and their holdings and their affluence, their networks, and all this sort of thing. And so that puts them, even though presently it's no longer legal, slavery is no longer legal, still descendants of those who were slave holders are in a much better position, or descendants of those who never were slaves are in a much better position than those who were not, generationally speaking. And so the idea of affirmative action is, in order to equalize things, equalize opportunity, we should do that. Now, there are the counterpoint to this, though, is not affirmative action, doesn't that present a case of reverse discrimination? Because what we are effectively doing is identifying these groups of people who previously were identified because of racial heritage. We are giving advantages to them because of their racial heritage. I mean, the only way to choose or to pick out who is of this group and who is not is on the basis of race, those racial traits, for example. So there, isn't this just the case of reverse discrimination? That, of course, is a charge that's brought up by critics of affirmative action. And the last thing, really, that I want to bring up underneath this is a rather new idea, and by new I mean probably it has its roots back in the late 70s, early 80s. It has its roots in the ideas of black theology from James Cone, and then it works its way up through what is today known as critical race theory. Critical race theory. Now, this is something that is relatively new, and so you might hear about it as a sort of a buzzword. You hear the terms like privilege, white privilege, or white fragility, terms like microaggressions and all this sorts of things. All of these are terms associated with critical race theory. Now, critical race theory basically is a way of deconstructing language that is often used in order to describe race and in order to describe the power structures in our society. For example, we talk about rights, and we talk about legal rights and moral rights and justice and this sort of thing. And oftentimes, a person who's a proponent of critical race theory will say, oftentimes when you talk about a person's individual rights, that sort of language is used in order to maintain the status quo, which is actually a disparity of privilege between those who are majority culture and those who are minority culture. And so if I talk about my property rights, for example, and I say you can't tax me at that rate because I have a right to retain my own property, well, a person from critical race theory would say, well, that just goes to perpetuate the current status quo, which favors the majority culture and disfavors the minority culture. It puts them at a disadvantage. Because while you might have property rights, the people who are in minority culture, they don't have as much property, so they're trying to get up, they're trying to get ahead, and they may have an equal right to keep what is theirs, but because they don't have as much, and they don't have as much opportunity to get as much, then really property rights doesn't help them. So what we need to do is make things equal, make opportunity equal, and so forth. Go for equity rather than equality. Now, so that's how language sometimes is used. They would say in order to perpetuate the status quo. So when we're talking about critical race theory, though, there's a couple of concepts that we need to be very aware of. For example, traditional language of race, such as terms like black and white, are kind of redefined when it comes to critical race theory. Because rather than speaking to racial characteristics such as skin color and hair texture and eye shape and this sort of thing, when we hear the terms black and white as it relates to critical race theory, these are referring to classes of people who are at a disadvantage versus classes of people who are in majority culture and therefore have the advantage in society. So it's not talking about white people and black people per se, strictly speaking. What it's talking about is groups of people who have the advantage, and those are going to be called white, that's going to be labeled white, versus those who don't have the advantage, who have a disadvantage, and those are going to be called black. So people who have the advantage in a culture, doesn't matter what actual ethnicity they are, if they have the advantage in society, they fit into the power structures, they can move within those circles. Those people who have the advantage, those are white people, versus black people who are those who are disadvantaged. Now, strictly speaking, that's what critical race theory talks about. So race is no longer attached to ethnicity, no longer attached to genetics. It's attached to sort of a sociological standing. And in a given society, for example, in Myanmar, there could be people who look very similar in terms of racial characteristics. They look, at least to a Western untrained eye, they look very similar. They look Asian, of Asian descent. However, ethnically speaking or culturally speaking, within their culture, there are ways to determine which group or which class of people have advantage versus which class has disadvantage. And those who are advantaged, they would be called the white class, versus those who are disadvantaged would be called the black class. Now, proponents of critical race theory hold that racism is permanent. Because of this, racism is permanent because there's always going to be a group that has the advantage in society. And there's always going to be a group that has the disadvantage. And sometimes in a given society, that might oscillate so that this group at one time is on the bottom while this one's on the top. And it may be historically speaking that things change, a revolution happens. This one now is on the top and this one's on the bottom. Still, racism is an ever-present thing because there's always a group that has advantage, there's always a group that has disadvantage. Now, in order to try to minimize or mitigate the distinctions between these groups, then basically the privileged class should use their privilege to serve the interests of those who are not privileged. The privileged class should use their privilege in order to serve the interest of those who are not privileged. So those who are privileged, even though it may serve their interest to talk about property rights so they can retain their wealth, they can retain their property, it actually is better for them if they choose to not accentuate property rights or focus on that and rather accentuate on maybe higher taxes so that we can provide for those who are at a disadvantage. That's what people who are in the advantage class are called to do. That's how they are. They are to help redistribute not just wealth, but also advantage or power or opportunity among those who are at disadvantage. That is the notion of critical race theory. Well, it's a lot to think about in terms of discrimination. Like I said at the beginning of this lecture, there's a lot in our culture that really involves this topic. Make sure that you take good notes on the lecture. Make sure that you do all the work that is shown on the syllabus and in this module. And we will catch you next time. Have a great week.